Hello, everyone. Welcome to the First Unitarian Society of Milwaukee's online worship service. I'm Reverend Dina McFeeters, and I'm honored to serve as Associate Minister. We welcome people of all genders, sexualities, ages, races, ethnicities, histories, and bodies. We welcome your mind, your heart, and your spirit. We welcome all that you are carrying with you today and all that your heart longs to set down. We'd like to pay a special welcome to guests joining us today. If you're visiting for the first time or joining us from afar, why don't you say hello in the chat and tell us where you're joining us from? I welcome you to our worship service today by inviting you to repeat our mission after me. We gather to nurture the spirit, engage the mind, and inspire action. Let's return to our beloved sanctuary for the lighting of the flaming chalice, symbol of Unitarian Universalism.
Good morning. I'm so happy to be here. Last week, Valis Drake provided a rich history of her memories from 58 years as a member of this church. Today, I'm going to take you from that far end of the spectrum in terms of length of membership to the other end of the spectrum. I'm a relatively new member of the church. In fact, this is only the third service that I'll attend in person in the beautiful sanctuary. But because of the warm welcoming I found in your virtual community, I already feel very much a part of this congregation. I want to take just a few minutes to tell you about some of the journey that got me here. As a child, I always welcomed Sunday services in a Presbyterian church as refuge from the noise and discontent of life at home. The organ music and sound of the entire congregation singing, as if one voice, were such balm to my spirit. But I always had some questions about the portrayal of God and of heaven in the Bible readings each week. A lot of the stories in the Old and New Testaments just didn't make sense to me. But I did listen to and like the sermons, homilies which focused on living an ethical life in the here and now. So even though many of my questions remained unanswered, I came to realize that, for me, reminders about how to live a good life were critical to my own spiritual development. In my teens, I drifted away from church. Years later, my late husband Michael and I would periodically feel the desire to rekindle our connections with the mainline churches of our youth. But those connections never quite gelled as our doubts about Christian doctrine continued, even as we loved the actual services themselves. So we again would drift off. Then over the last decade, I began to explore the tenets and principles of Zen Buddhism. I find that, for me, these principles serve as key guidelines for living an intentional life of compassion and kindness. I became and remain a member of a small Zen community in Madison. I found, however, that I began to feel a yearning to rekindle the sense of connection to the forms of worship of my youth, that sense of refuge and the familiar flow of the liturgy. But again, I didn't want to feel compelled to commit to any specific creed or doctrine about divinity that I might have doubts about. In 2020, I made the decision to move from Madison to Milwaukee, in part to reset my life in ways that I hadn't even quite defined yet. I set about searching for sources of community and connection in my newly adopted city. To my delight, I found, even in the midst of the pandemic, the sense of community and spiritual friendship I was seeking, initially with the poetry contemplation group here, and then with a number of other First Church groups I participated in, all via Zoom, of course. But even within COVID restrictions and constraints, I've been able to develop some actual face-to-face friendships with members of these groups. Of course, I had to be patient about actually being able to attend Sunday services in person, but I started attending the online services. The church's mission statement, to nurture the spirit, engage the mind, and inspire action, felt just right to me. In 2021, I became a member, taking the membership classes and being welcomed to church membership, again, all via Zoom. Then last December 24th, I attended a Christmas Eve service here with one of my new friends, Katie Phillips. When I walked in, the beautifully decorated sanctuary and lighted candles immediately felt so familiar and welcoming to me. And when Reverend Jennifer assured that all are welcome here, whether one interprets the story of Jesus literally, historically, or as a metaphor for how to live a good life, I knew I was home. So again, I'm very happy to be here and am delighted to support the stewardship of this warm place. I am grateful for your welcome and your friendship.
From the light of days remembered burns a beacon bright and clear, guiding hands and hearts and spirits into faith set free from fear. When the fire of commitment sets our mind and soul ablaze, when our hunger and our passion meet to call us on our way, when we live with deep assurance of the flame that burns within, then our promise finds fulfillment and our future can begin. From the stories of our living rings a song both brave and free, calling pilgrims still to witness to the life of liberty. When the fire of commitment sets our mind and soul ablaze, when our hunger and our passion need to call us on our way, when we live with deep assurance of the flame that burns within, then our promise finds fulfillment and our future can begin. From the dreams of youthful vision comes a new prophetic voice, which demands a deeper justice built by our courageous choice. When the fire of commitment sets our mind and soul ablaze, when our hunger and our passion need to call us on our way, when we live with deep assurance of the flame that burns within, then our promise finds fulfillment and our future can begin.
Good morning. I'm Laurel Brooks, and I am delighted to serve as your worship associate today. As the earth returns to its annual promise of spring, it's easy to think about renewing faith. It's a promise that has always been kept during my life, And yet each year we wait for it expectantly and hopefully, and rejoice when it finally does arrive without any regard for punctuality. We must wait for spring to keep its promise, but we don't have to wait for each other. The human idea of faith, for me, means trust. Trust in people I love and who have loved me. Their steadfast presence has allowed me to have faith in a world that would otherwise seem unreliable. And lucky for me, these bulwarks of trust began appearing early on in my life. On a September day in 1957, I began first grade in Missoula, Montana. My first grade teacher was Miss Morse, aptly named as she began to teach me to decode the messages the world would send me through the symbolic systems of numbers and language. My public school education continued to be a source of joy and wonder for the following 12 years, with teachers who answered their calling with unreserved commitment. I began studying French in junior high school. My love of that subject endured and ultimately delivered me to Mrs. Lennon. Mrs. Lennon was not warm and soft. She expected you to meet her on her terms. She expected you to be a whole person growing in independence. She was born in northern Maine, committing to teaching at an early age, and taught in lumber camps among children whose first language was French. She was a very powerful figure and a profound influence. I treasured her presence in my life. When I was 15, I found myself in an English class taught by Miss R. She was a serious teacher, but uninspiring. Some friends were in a different English class taught by Miss V. They were so enthusiastic about her class that I asked to transfer into it. The guidance counselor approved the transfer, but school policy required that the student and teacher discuss the change prior to moving. Miss R invited me to come in after school on a day when she was working with the school newspaper staff. When I arrived, the room was full of curious students, and she took me back to her desk, on which sat a very thick file. She said that was my school file that had followed me throughout my career. She was sorry to see that this was not the first time I had had a problem like this, and that my French teacher's comments were particularly troubling. She could not, however, disclose what she had found. I was shattered. The idea that my beloved French teacher would have found me unacceptable in any way was devastating. Nothing in my school experience had prepared me to see myself as the person Miss R described. The world I knew was breaking apart. It had been a haven of safety that taught me to be confident as I strode into the future. But Miss R shook her head sadly. She would like to write something positive in my file, but she could not do so if I pursued this transfer. I left in tears. My mother was shocked and called the guidance counselor, who shared her reaction. The following day at school, I was adrift. I couldn't look anyone in the eye. I had lost confidence in myself and trust in my teachers. Mrs. Lennon found me in the hall as I made my way between classes. She took me aside. She stood close to me, eye to eye. She had heard what happened and wanted to set the record straight. She had never made any negative remarks about me or written anything negative in my file. I could breathe again. She went on to say that she was delighted to have me in class, that she valued my enthusiasm for French and my active participation. And as I stood there listening to her voice, I could feel the world coming back into focus. There is a gospel song, His Eyes on the Sparrow. The inference is that a loving, powerful God watches over us and cares for us. I know that many believers are comforted by this idea, and I'm glad for them, even though it doesn't have that meaning for me. However, I find the song lovely and, in a way, true. I was the sparrow. Mrs. Lennon saw me fall and reached out her hand in a way that only she could do. We have all been the sparrow, lifted up by tender hands belonging to those we trust and love. And hopefully, we have each in turn reached out in love and compassion to cradle a sparrow, so that it may once again take flight. By this giving and receiving, our trust in life is renewed again and again. So, let's celebrate that gift of trust together as we walk out into this long-awaited first day of spring.
In season 9 of the beloved British television series Call the Midwife, elderly nun Sister Monica Joan has lost her faith. She skips chapel and spends many hours in bed, or as she says, in repose. She has lost the spark in her eye and initiates none of her usual mischievous capers. Her sisters and the other midwives are gentle and patient with her. They understand and accept that human beings may go through a dark night of the soul from time to time. They try to entice Sister Monica Joan to work in the garden, one of her former passions, where she used to replant the beautiful yellow dandelions that Mr. Buckle weeded out. But the garden does not entice. She sits on a bench overlooking the garden and reflects on her lost faith instead. Because she is a nun and has spent her life serving the order of St. Raymond Nonatus, losing her faith is a big deal. She wonders if her life has been wasted. During season 10, she finds her faith again. Where? She finds it while gazing at a placenta. Since Sister Monica Joan is retired from active midwifery, she seldom witnesses a birth anymore, unless a woman in labor finds her way to Nonata's house and desperately rings the doorbell. Such was the event that brought Sister Monica Joan to witness a birth and to gaze at a placenta, the very human stuff that protects and nourishes, that sustains life in the womb. With awe and wonder in her voice, she says, "I have examined placentas in all kinds of light, gas jets, candle flames, torch beams as bombs fell. I never cease to marvel at its beauty when exposed, the least visible of all the body's organs laid before us for our scrutiny. It grows with us, it fires us, it sustains the very beating of our blood. When I see this with all its lines and traceries, I see the miracle of God Himself. I see His handiwork and I see His love. I see where I began, what fed me and what feeds me now. It is complete. And so, within His love am I. I witnessed a new life beginning, and my doubt has died." Sister Monica Joan had a crisis of faith in God. That is how we usually think about faith. We equate it with faith in God or doctrine. But faith is more than that, and we Unitarian Universalists could benefit from exploring the Word by following its contours and detours in our lives, redefining it for ourselves, and renewing our faith where we have it. The Reverend Jean Newyar, who was raised in the Universalist Church, wrote in her book, Fluent in Faith, "There is so much to believe in, but underlying belief is faith, the source of our spiritual wholeness and strength. Belief lives in the mind. It is a cognitive, intellectual dimension of religion made up of ideas. Faith is deeper. It is a profound existential sense of trust. It is a sense of safety and coherence, a sense of serenity, of courage, loyalty, and comfort, a sense of feeling at home in the universe." Now, don't get me wrong, beliefs and belief systems are important. Beliefs affect our actions and behavior profoundly. Beliefs can create and sustain life or demean and destroy it. We notice this many times a day as we witness what happens in the world. But what about faith? That underlying layer that can infuse everything, even if we don't know exactly what we believe. What did you have faith in when you were a child? Did that change as you became an adult? Have you ever lost faith? If so, when and in what? Did you find your faith again? If so, how? Did it feel different? Let's talk about definitions for a moment. In her book, Writing to Wake the Soul, Unitarian Universalist minister Karen Herring wrote, "In the early teachings of many world religions, the word faith appears not as a noun, but as a verb. It is a way that we live, a loyalty that we grow into over time. In the original Buddhist texts, the Pali word for faith meant to place the heart upon. Our own English word faith derives from the Latin word fides, also the root of fidelity, meaning trust or trustworthy, and implying something or someone we can rely on. Faith as an act of placing one's heart suggests a give and take that requires movement. It is more akin to dancing than to doctrine." Buddhist teacher Sharon Salzberg wrote in her book, Faith, Trusting Your Own Deepest Experience, "The common understanding we have of faith is that it is synonymous with religious adherence. But the tendency to equate faith with doctrine and then argue about terminology and concepts distracts us from what faith is actually about. In my understanding, whether faith is connected to a deity or not, its essence lies in trusting ourselves to discover the deepest truths on which we can rely." Let's pause for a minute because I want to acknowledge that some of you may have had harmful, even traumatic experiences with faith in the past. Previous faith communities or religious authorities may have silenced your questions, told you that you were going to hell, shamed your identity, or violated your boundaries. Those wounds may still be with you and might suppress any curiosity about the word faith. Perhaps the word faith is not for you. But how about the word trust? Karen Herring tells a story about her experience with trust and faith as a child. She writes, "I grew up in a family that camped. In a feat just short of a miracle, we fit 6 of us into a canvas-topped tent trailer meant for 4. One night, bedded down in a campsite on the edge of a high river bluff, we awoke to the sound of rain pelting our tent top and rivulets streaming beneath the camper, cascading over the nearby cliff. The wind caught the edges of the trailer's canvas until it billowed and snapped with percussive warning. My parents exchanged urgent, undecipherable whispers. A flashlight beam briefly cut the darkness. The zippered doorway whined open and closed, and my father disappeared into the storm. A few minutes later, he returned, soaked to the skin, reporting that we were now secured for the night. Using the fat ropes from his Navy hammock, he'd tied the camper to a nearby tree with a sailor's expert knots. We could all go back to sleep, he said, and we did. Powerless as we felt in the gales of the storm, those thick ropes and the strong knots we knew my father could tie tethered us to something larger and unseen that we trusted. But how do we know what is trustworthy? How do we know where to put our faith and what we can rely on in the middle of a storm? As the morning light would tell us, the tree we were tied to likely had a root system too shallow to hold us securely, had the wind blown much harder that night. When I look back on this now, she writes, I realize that more than the rope and the tree, we had placed our faith in my father and his rain-soaked assessment of the storm and our position in it. Perhaps you are familiar with the book Faith Without Certainty, published in 2005 by Unitarian Universalist minister and professor Paul Razor. In it he wrote, religious liberalism often involves a willingness to affirm faith without certainty. This is not the same thing as faith without conviction. It does mean that religious liberals tend to hold faith claims with a certain tentativeness. This is partly a result of a liberal mindset that is always testing and second-guessing itself. It also reflects the liberal commitment to open-ended inquiry and the realization that truth is not given once for all time. Yet this open-mindedness can also make us reluctant to commit ourselves too deeply to anything. This brings to mind the warning offered by liberal theological ethicist James Luther Adams many years ago, that the liberal commitment to openness, quote, can produce the mind that is simply open at both ends. I would add to Razor's analysis that people who come into Unitarian Universalism from prior religious communities may be carrying wounds that need the healing freedom and open space of inquiry, and have well-founded suspicion of commitment to traditional religious language. On the other hand, those of us who grew up in the Unitarian Universalist tradition may hunger for the depth of religious language and feel bereft at the avoidance of it. Those who come into our religion from no prior tradition might just be puzzled and surprised when they reach out for language that names their spiritual but not religious experience and find empty air. We all may benefit from and need help translating faith language into something that will help us grow deep roots and provide reliable sustenance in the storm. We lose faith frequently these days. Over the last several years, I personally have lost faith in our society's current system of policing, our judicial system, our voting system, the U.S. Postal Service, cybersecurity, the effectiveness of public health messaging, and more. I have not lost my trust in science and the use of reason. I just wish more people believed in those. Sharon Salzberg names and describes the difference between bright faith and verifying faith, which could be useful for us. She tells about her journey to India in 1970 on her quest to learn about Buddhism. When she finally arrived at Bodh Gaya, where the Buddha attained enlightenment, she fell in love with everything there: the meditation teachers, the community of students, the Buddha's teachings, the place itself, its teeming wonder of life, as she said. She says this state of love-filled delight is known in Buddhism as bright faith. With bright faith, we feel exalted as we are lifted out of our normal sense of insignificance, thrilled as we no longer feel lost and alone. It enables us to step out, step away, and see what we can make of our lives. It can happen in a special place or through meeting a special teacher or reading something inspiring. She cautions, though, that bright faith is simply a beginning, and not a beginning in which we surrender discriminating intelligence. but rather one in which we surrender cynicism and apathy. Its abundant energy propels us forward into the unknown. However, she continues, we must arrive at an inner faith, not dependent upon externals, something we can carry with us, because bright faith doesn't last. Like a crush on our fourth grade teacher, bright faith is meant to be a prelude to a more mature regard. For our faith to mature, we need to weigh what others tell us against our own experience of the truth. In Buddhism, she said, the process of examining the teacher or teaching is called verifying faith. To move from the floating world of bright faith to the more solid ground of verifying faith, we have to ask questions, find our voice, explore the teachings for ourselves. Does this ring true for you? As UUs, I think we spend most of our time in verifying faith, which is fine, but not to the exclusion of naming a deeper sense of trust on which we can rely when times get tough. Do you have any phrases, poems, or bits of scripture that support you in times of trouble, that help to renew your trust in life? Maybe it's something your parents said to you at bedtime, or a scrap of goodness from the liturgy of the religious community in which you were raised. Maybe a poem that you learned by heart at school, or a quote you found that inspires. Some of you put the famous words of anchorist Julian of Norwich at the bottom of your emails. All will be well, and all will be well, and all manner of things will be well. Lest those words seem ridiculous, it's important to know that she wrote them in the Middle Ages during a time of war and plague. Psalm 23 may be embedded in your memory, especially the verse, "Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." The Black Church has the phrase, "a way out of no way," to express that when things are at their worst, there is still faith to find a way through. We don't have to like the word faith or even use it to be a Unitarian Universalist, but to be whole human beings capable of giving and receiving in community, we need to have trust, a deep trust in something or someone. In what or whom do you trust in these challenging times? On what do you place your heart? Dear ones, I'll leave you with these closing words by Arthur Foote. May peace dwell within our hearts and understanding in our minds. May courage steel our wills and love of truth forever guide us. May it be so.
We are going, heaven knows where we are going. We know within, and we will get there. Heaven knows how we will get there.